Hello again, 102. In this video, we will now go over how President Roosevelt and Congress responded to the outbreak of the wars in Europe and Asia. We'll do in the next one in the years between 1933 and 1941. Neutrality was what the official position of the United States was in the 30s. And in 1935, in response to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and the Nye Committee hearings, President Roosevelt signed the first of several neutrality laws. And the Neutrality Act of 1935 prohibited Americans from selling weapons or traveling on ships owned by nations at war. And the law reflected the desire of most Americans to stay out of Europe's conflicts, as we historically always did. As a Minnesota senator declared in 1935, the hell with Europe and the rest of those nations. In 1936, Congress revised the Neutrality Act by banning loans to warring nations. It was believed by Congress at that time that that was one of the reasons why we got involved in the First World War, because we had loaned so much money to the Allies. We went to war to make sure they were going to pay us back. Roosevelt, however, was not so sure. And in October of 1937, he delivered a speech in Chicago in the heartland of isolationism, in which he called for international cooperation to quarantine the aggressors responsible for disturbing the world peace, especially the Japanese who had assaulted China. But his appeal for a more active American role in world affairs fell flat in Congress and across the nation. And in the 1937 Neutrality Act, they modified it somewhat by saying that non-military goods for warring nations could be sold. And it was sold on a cash and carry basis. A nation would have to pay cash and then carry the American-made goods away in its own ships. That's okay. And in 1939, it's further modified by allowing military supplies for Britain and France. After 6 weeks of debate, they passed the Neutrality Act of 1939, which allowed Britain and France to send their own ships again to the United States with the same idea that they would have to carry them away, pay for them, and then carry them away themselves. Now we're beginning to prepare America for war. The U.S. Army, by 1939, numbered only 175,000 troops. And President Roosevelt in May of 1940 had a desire for a military buildup. And he also wants to increase aid to Great Britain, and they are going to reinstitute the draft because of the menace of the Nazis. They had been building their military up basically since Hitler came to power in 1933. And this was one of their big weapons, was the Untersee boat, or the U-boat. And they are much ahead of Britain, France, and the United States by the end of the 30s. As had occurred during the Great War, German submarines destroyed many of the ships carrying supplies from America to Great Britain. And to address the challenge, Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, whose mother was an American, negotiated in early September 1940 the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, in which 50 old U.S. warships went to the British Royal Navy in return for allowing the U.S. to build military bases on British island colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere in Newfoundland and in the North Atlantic. 2 weeks later, on September the 16th, 1940, Roosevelt made an even more controversial decision, opposed even by his wife Eleanor, when he pushed through a reluctant Congress the first peacetime conscription in history, requiring the registration of all 16 million men aged 21 to 35. The world crisis really transformed FDR after the problems of the Second New Deal and the court-packing scheme and how he lost popularity and the fallout of that defeat. And now he's reinvigorated by foreign events. And adding to Roosevelt's concerns was the possibility that the Germans might have a secret weapon. The famous physicist Albert Einstein, an Austrian Jew who had fled Nazism, alerted Roosevelt in the fall of 1939 that the Germans were trying to create atomic bombs. So the Manhattan Project was born. And almost 200,000 people worked on this project, including Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who led a team of distinguished scientists scattered among several secret facilities across the country. The Manhattan Project was so secret that Vice President Truman knew nothing about it. The Battle of Britain takes place, and German bombers attacked Britain in 1940 during the Blitz. Having conquered Western Europe, Hitler began planning the invasion of Great Britain, Operation Sea Lion. But the Germans first sought to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF, before invading the island nation. And in July and August of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched day and night bombing raids against military targets across southeast England. The Royal Air Force, with the benefit of radar, a secret new technology, surprised the world by fending off the German assault. Hitler then ordered his bombers to target civilians in cities, especially London, in nighttime raids designed to terrorize the nation. During September and October of 1940, the Germans caused massive destruction in Britain's major cities. And there's the Blitz in London. And St. Paul's Cathedral survived this attack. It's one of the few buildings in London that did not get destroyed. And Churchill said, "We will never surrender. We shall fight them in the streets. We shall fight them in the fields." His famous speech that he gave on radio. But the German bombing campaign, it enraged rather than demoralized the British people. "Is that the best you can do, Adolf?" said a newspaper headline. At the same time, the British fighter pilots were destroying 1,300 German warplanes, and the British success in the air was the decisive turning point in the war. For in October 1940, Hitler scrapped his planned invasion of the British Isles, and it was the first battle he had lost. And that concludes the first part of how we are responding to the outbreak of wars in Europe, and we'll go over Asia in the next section.